Hey guys, it's Danny the Medic, and today's video is a video presentation from the floater doctor. Now, do you like anatomy? Do you like science? Do you like eyeballs? This is the video for you. I really liked it because, I'm into this kind of stuff. So this is 40 minutes of him explaining stuff. Now, this video is really good because, the consultation is 250 bucks, okay? So, and you get all this here for free. You get to he is so knowledgeable, so good, explained like so much. Now, I study anatomy, physiology, I study eyeballs, all that stuff, but there's stuff in there I never knew. So good, okay? So here we are, the presentation of eyeballs, your floater, what happens from the floater doctor.
So this is a little bit more of a formal presentation, and it covers really sort of three prongs. The first is educational. Most people who come here, they've already read every word of every page and watched every video. So some of this will be review. And even if you were a doctor, I usually just sort of apologize and say, look, some of this is going to be, a lot of this is going to be a review. You might still learn a little something, but just humor me. I feel the need to take you alpha to omega. So it's educational. As I mentioned earlier, I spend a lot of time managing expectations because I think that a well-educated patient has more reasonable expectations. They realize that it's not magic, that it's not automated software that's doing this, that it is a very manual process. So manage expectations always. And then thirdly, it is a lengthy, verbal, informed consent process. Mm-hmm. Doctors get a little lazy. They do a lot of cataract surgery. They do a lot of LASIK. And, they bring you in for your surgery, and then it's like, well, here's a piece of paper, just read and sign this, and we'll get you going. I think that the informed consent is supposed to really be a conversation with the doctor, and so it's really just sort of a lengthy thing. I do have a piece of paper that is my informed consent. That piece of paper is actually sort of like the short, condensed version of this lengthier conversation. So I think this sort of three-pronged approach to this is very, very important. I do this with everybody. So. Not just for video. So this is the eye. This is actually not the eye. What it is an artist's illustration of an enlarged cross-section of a human eye, to be more precise. I wouldn't be the first one to describe the eye as a camera or as a camera or similar to the eye. There's reasons that they're very similar. We could say that that a camera is a very simple version of a much more sophisticated eye. And draw a simple basic camera here. In the front of the box will be some lenses, and in the back will be a roll of film or a sensor. We can make it a little bit more sophisticated. We could put a variable aperture in there that opens and closes and regulates the amount of light, changes the depth of field and the amount of light, and throw a shutter on there, and voila, we got ourselves a camera. So if this camera is focused off at optical infinity, off at the distance, the light rays will be bouncing off the tree, the house, the mountain range, whatever you're taking a picture of, and the reflected light rays will be entering the camera like so, and then the optics of those lenses will refract or bend the light rays into a focus onto the film or the sensor. In this case, it would be chemically or electronically processed, printed out, and you got yourself a picture. So the eye has some homologous or analogous structures. We could say the globe of the eye, this main part of the eye, excuse me, I got tickle in my throat, excuse me. This main part of the eye is similar to the camera body. We have our optics up front, which is the cornea and the lens, the optics up front. In between the cornea and the lens is this muscular structure here called the iris, and actually in the eye it's also called an iris. The opening, the aperture of that iris is the pupil. Normally, that will respond to bright light by the pupil will get smaller to reduce its size and reduce the amount of light getting into the eye. In dim or dark light, that pupil will naturally open up to allow more light in because it needs it. In this case with you, I've put some eye drops in here which will pharmacologically affect that and force that pupil open. So we're dilating your pupil right now as we speak. Okay. The equivalent of the film or the sensor is this retina, and the retina is really just brain tissue that has been pulled out on a stalk as the eye forms during embryological fetal development.
Well, it goes all the way out to
Goes
over
way
here,
out here
huh?
to the periphery, yeah, way out there.
Amazing. I never
Yeah.
knew. I always thought it's just in the back.
No,
Okay.
well, that's how we can see way out, way out here and way out here. We have, essentially 180-degree peripheral vision. It's not very good resolution out here. Out in the periphery is your sort of like your low resolution area here. The macula is this area right here. That's where you have a greater density of those rods and cones. And then the dead center of your eye is the fovea right there. That's where they're really, really concentrated. So we have sort of a differential resolution. This is your 20 megapixel camera. This is your 4 megapixel camera. Some variation in there. But this is basically brain tissue. The rods and cones take the light information. They do a little local processing, and then they send that information through the nerves, through the optic nerve, back to the brain, and the brain sorts it all out and says, hey, I can see what's going on out there. And by the way, on that note, we can only see what's outside our eye, okay? If you're aware of anything going on in here, we'll get to that, then it's called an entoptic phenomenon, but you don't actually see things that are inside your eye. You can only truly see, sensorily see, what's outside the eye out there. What are some other comparisons? Well, the camera here, like I said, is just an empty black box filled with air. The eye, instead, is filled with fluids, plural, fluids. There are two different fluid chambers separated by a thin membrane right here. We have fluid produced up here, actively dynamically secreted into that space, and then it is passively drained through a drainage system. So it's produced and drained all day, all night, all day, all night. And it's the balance of these two plumbing processes, production, drainage, that determines the eye pressure, which we just measured earlier. Okay.
Oh, so it's not the pressure of the whole thing, it's just the pressure
Well,
of the
the
front?
pressure is actually the same everywhere.
Oh.
It's like saying, is the pressure just at the car tire's stem valve, or is the pressure everywhere? Well, it's everywhere. It's just conveniently measured through the stem valve when we put the little measure on there. But the pressure is everywhere. But the control of that pressure, or the pressure is resulting from this plumbing process that's going up front. But it is the same everywhere, truly. The most accurate way would be actually just stick a needle inside the eye and hook it up to a manometer, and then you could sort of measure the pressure, but that's kind of inconvenient here.
Oh, yeah.
So instead, we end up kind of pushing against the cornea and sort of measuring how much it's pushing back at us and getting us a pretty good measurement of that. Okay, so that's one system. We're going to ignore that for now. We might come back to that. Then we have this fluid chamber right here. Now this is the vitreous, sometimes called the vitreous gel. Is it gel? Well, it's kind of gel-like. Maybe more accurately, the chemists would call it a viscoelastic fluid. It's viscous because it's thicker than water. It's elastic because it has some sort of gel-like properties and qualities to it. Regardless, it's still essentially a fluid. Why is it a fluid? Because it's mostly water. We'll say about 99% water. Mostly water. Not very interesting.
Look, guys, he's even writing upside down. Look at this.
We left-handers have special skills. And there's about 1% of some other stuff. We'll say some collagen proteins, some fancy sugars like hyaluronic acid, a little bit of antioxidant. I'll make those letters smaller, antioxidant, a little bit. That's not really so important here. So we have a small amount of stuff in mostly water, and it gives us this sort of viscoelastic fluid. This here is a hand sanitizing gel, essentially. I think it's what makes it gel, like glycerin probably, and it is transparent. It is a liquid because it flows, but it also is a little thicker, viscous, and has a little bit of sort of gel-like property to it. So it kind of gets you the idea of what a viscoelastic gel is. Now, from a sort of evolutionary standpoint, why is it a gel and why is it not something else? It really doesn't have to be a gel. In fact, you can remove that gel and just replace it with saline, and the eye does okay. All this collagen protein and hyaluronic acid may actually be just a remnant of the early development of the eye. It's actually a very complex process where there's sort of like these buds that come off the brain and kind of forms this cup, and then this other stuff forms in the front here from different sources, and then you actually have blood vessels coursing through here. It's actually a pretty complex place in the first 4 months while the fetus is developing, and then this kind of regresses and disappears and sometimes leaves behind a little bit of junk. But this gel just may be trapped in this space with nowhere to go. And fortunately, it remains pretty darn transparent, for most of the people, most of the time, measured in decades, 4 decades, 5 decades, 6 decades. You know, some people never really have much of a problem with the vitreous and it stays clear throughout their entire life. And it's an area that really is not biologically active. You know, you have some dead structural proteins dispersed in that space, some sugars, fancy sugars, hyaluronic acid, that's kind of dispersed in that space, kind of stabilizing things. But, you know, there's no living, breathing cells, there's no cell division, there's no respiration, there's no metabolic activity, nothing is really getting in or getting out. It's really just kind of an empty space that nobody cares much about, including the eye doctors. So generally, the areas of interest in eye care, ophthalmology, optometry, is this area, because we have the cornea and refractive surgery, we have cataract surgery, we have the problem of elevated eye pressures and such, other sort of inflammation diseases and things like that. This is where a lot of activity takes place. And then also is this space back here, you know, the retina, the optic nerve, the macula, macular degeneration, glaucoma damage, retinal holes, tears and detachments. So we really tend to skip, ophthalmology tends to skip from this area of interest to this area of interest and just kind of skips right past the vitreous, including optically. And what I mean by that is the instruments that we examine the eye are kind of designed for this area, and then, you know, different optics for this area, and not really so good for the vitreous. So, you know, one of the sayings that I've developed to sort of reflect this is that floaters are something that the patient sees, but the doctor doesn't necessarily see or fully appreciate. And part of that is just the optics that we use to examine the eye are just really not good for that space. You have to really be looking for them and using, you know, contact lenses and special lighting and stuff to be able to really fully appreciate what's going on in this space. So I've had a lot of patients that have had some pretty significant floaters where they're like, yeah, my doctor didn't really see them, or they didn't really comment on them, and they, well, I know, because their focus was looking at the retina, so it's a little bit problematic. So for most of the people, most of the time, this stays pretty clear. Nobody really thinks much about it. Nobody's you know, spending much time talking about it, including the doctors, and there you go. So any change in this space that creates something that is optically denser than the surrounding area, essentially clear area, we'll call a floater. All right? And I don't like the term floater because these things are not floating.
They're not?
They're not floating.
Oh my God.
It's hard to believe.
You gotta change your channel name and everything.
I know.
Oh.
Maybe more accurately, they could be called suspenders. They're suspended in that gel.
Ah.
But the suspender doctor doesn't sound very cool either.
Yeah, it sounds like you make, like, you know, fashion items.
Exactly.
Yeah.
My suspenders. Or I fix suspenders. I'm the suspender doctor, right? Yeah, that could give a mixed message. So, but there is a problem with sort of describing these things. They don't flow. So any change that takes place. Now, there are some pathological entities. You could have a hemorrhage. You could have red blood cells in that space that can affect the vision. You could conceivably have a retinal detachment and have that sort of billowing around in that space. Not really a floater.
Oh, like the retina floating around in there? I mean, suspended around in there?
Well, you know, it's attached in some areas and loose and suspended out here, fully detached.
A loose retina. Oh,
yeah,
no, that's
so
not
that
good.
could conceivably. You could have inflammation. Some people have autoimmune disorders or inflammatory conditions where you can spill a lot of white blood cells into that area, and some discomfort and things that go with that. You could conceivably have foreign body in there. There's another weird thing where you get these crystals that form in this area here called asteroid hyalosis. Very, very bizarre, beautiful to look at, but really strange thing that happens. So there's some other, and that's not really pathological, but there's some other things that can cause densities. But the vast, vast, vast majority is or are these proteins that pre-existed in this space that have gone from being homogeneously distributed and optically transparent to aggregated, clumped, clouded, formed densities. So the presumption is that the floaters are not caused by proteins or anything else getting into this eye. It's the existing proteins that have been redistributed. And they might have different morphology or descriptions. One might be, well, you could have like a three-dimensional cloud. I'll just kind of stipple this area in here and say, it's a kind of a light cloud, maybe noticeable, maybe not really all that bothersome, but a light little aggregation and stickiness of those proteins causing them to come together. This could further progress to something smaller and denser. Now we're talking something that might be really quite bothersome. So there we go. That's kind of proteins kind of coming together. And by the way, if the proteins are coming together, that means that the surrounding area has less proteins, which is more watery. And so these, you know, one of the aging effects of the vitreous as we get older is the water, the vitreous tends to liquefy, undergo liquefaction, and tends to get a little more watery. and those proteins will kind of clump together again. So these might just be gradual aging changes of vitreous. In other words, it didn't happen overnight. It has been, well, they just kind of get worse over time. I'm seeing a little more stuff. Or they could have a different morphology where it might be more sort of cobwebs and strands and fibers, and it's the same sort of process, but just sort of different shape and different appearance to those things. The unifying feature of these floaters, we'll call them, collagen floaters, the unifying feature is that you have some sort of density in this optical system surrounded by optically clearer fluid, and you have light rays entering this camera-like system, and it has the capacity of casting a shadow or a disruption of vision on the shadow side. So this is the quote-unquote floater, but since it originates inside the eye, and my earlier definition is you can't see things that are in the eye, you're not actually seeing the floater. What you're aware of is the shadow or the disturbance or the disruption of vision on the shadow side being cast onto the retina. Okay, so you're not seeing floaters, you're seeing the shadows or the disturbance of the vision on the shadow side. And that's just kind of a definition of floaters. Now, there's a lot of variables that go into that change how you see those. A few highlights here. It's like, well, what are you looking at? You mentioned earlier, if I had a big bright wall to look at, or a big bright backlit screen, which actually that thing on the wall there is, if it gave you a big blank wall there, that will tend to make the shadows more contrasty. You'll have a darker shadow against a plain white background here. So, what are you looking at? If on the other hand, this was a busy wallpaper background, busy sort of background, well, the shadows will kind of get lost in the variegated patterns that you're looking at here. Okay, so what are you looking at matters. The brightness. Okay, so if you're in a bright environment, that tends to make your pupils smaller, right? That's a natural physiological response. If you have we'll just kind of standardize a small density in that location right there, and you have a small pupil, the light entering the eye tends to be a little bit more coherent, coming from a smaller source. That tends to cast more distinct, more defined, and longer coherent shadows. So a rule of thumb is the smaller the pupil, the more you'll see. And even smaller floaters will cast longer shadows. Now, if on the other hand, you're in a dim light situation, or as I am dilating you right now, the pupil is larger, the light is now coming in from a broader light source, and although the light coming in from this side will cast a shadow in this direction, the light coming in from this side will cast a shadow in this direction, but it will also tend to sort of negate or get rid of that, and same thing on this side. So in other words, you tend to get sort of more cone-shaped and shorter and less distinct shadows. You might see a little something, but it may not be as dark, as distinct. And some of these smaller ones, the shadows are just not going to reach the retina at all. So generally people say, I get a little bit of relief in the dark or the dim light, or when my doctor dilated my pupils, I didn't see the floaters as much. Well, there's an optical explanation for that, and that's what this is. And that, by the way, is also the explanation how low-dose atropine works, is we're not fully dilating the pupil, but we're getting a little bit of a mild increase in the size of the pupil, and that seems to sort of diminish those smaller floaters a bit. So that's the basis of the use of low-dose atropine. Then we can talk about location, just like real estate, location, location, location. If we have our floater there and it has some sort of shadow cast from that, if that same floater is moved here, where you're going to tend to see it more likely under virtually all circumstances or most circumstances, or if it's further out here, you may not see it at all. So generally, as a rule of thumb, the closer the floaters are to the retina, the more distinct, the more defined, the more bothersome they are. Those are pluses, and this is negatives. So generally, the closer the retina, the more likely you are to see them and all that. Okay. Then some very basic ones are, something larger compared to something smaller. That's more likely to be bothersome. Something of the same size that's denser versus translucent, that will tend to be more bothersome. Something that is down that central visual pathway as compared to out in the periphery, well, the ones in the center are going to be more bothersome because that's more important vision, central vision more important. And then the other thing about floaters is that, well, they move, and the problem with movement is, we are hardwired to be aware of movement, even out in the periphery. That's a protective thing. If you're walking through the jungle and there's a little movement out there. It might be a bird, it might be a jaguar. You know, one's a threat and one's not. So we need to be aware of even things that are going on in our periphery just to protect ourselves. You know, and maybe in the modern world, you know, if a big bus is coming in from the periphery, you know, you need to be aware that there's a big bus coming from the periphery so you don't step out into the street and get hit. So our lizard brain, the sort of more base and primitive part of our brain, is always sort of mindful of movement, and we're kind of startled by movement and things like that. So one of the problems with floaters is, you know, even if you intellectually understand and are reassured about your floaters, oh, it's just proteins, I'm not going to go blind, it's just floaters, right? You can intellectually reassure yourself and not be in a state, a fit of panic and anxiety, but that movement is always going to still draw your attention to it because you can't turn off your lizard brain, right? Okay, so that's a few basics of just floaters themselves. Now, there's also a different event, for lack of a better term. I mentioned this membrane right here. And this membrane actually continues all the way around. So it's like a little baggie or a little sac. It is vitreous proteins. It's a little bit more organized. It's like a little two-dimensional sheet. In this configuration, nobody really cares about it. Nobody really talks about it. It's not really of interest. In fact, we really don't even see it, to tell you the truth. And it's not symptomatic. So nobody cares. It's just part of the normal eye anatomy that we don't see. Now, there is an event where some free fluid, water, can get underneath that membrane and cause it to shift and to pull away. So in cross-section, kind of in a simple cartoonish cross-section, you might get that membrane pulled away as water goes to this backside over here. Okay, so this is a very common event as we get older. It's a posterior vitreous detachment. Okay, posterior, the backside, vitreous, separation or detachment. That membrane sort of pulls away as fluid shifts. So it's really just a fluid shift and a membrane move, you know, a pre-existing membrane moving to another area there. And it's pretty darn common. If we grabbed a bunch of 60-year-olds off the street, we'd find a good 25% of, try to do that upside down, 25% of 60-year-olds will have a PVD, and that goes up to 60% of 80-year-olds. So very, very common as we get older. It's just an age-related phenomenon as the vitreous liquefies and turns less from a gel to more to a fluid. Now, if you just have that membrane going across there, if you had a PVD, that's not necessarily symptomatic, and certainly that isn't bringing a lot of people in here complaining of floaters. You might have had, if a person has a PVD, they might have had some flashes of light, some peripheral arcs or flashes of light. Where does that come from? Well, as that membrane is peeling away, if it's not fully pulled away, the vitreous has sort of partially come away from there. There might be a little pulling and tugging on the retina right here. And this is in 3 dimensions. It's a little, you know, interface here. And if that, as you move your eye and move your head and that vitreous is sort of ebbing and flowing a little bit, if there's a little bit of traction on the retina, since the retina can only see light, it can't feel traction, it can't feel pressure, it can't feel hot or cold or vibration, it can only see light. So that internal traction will be transmitted as a little flash of light, a little flash of light that they see. Okay. Fortunately, the vast majority of those will eventually separate and pull away without any fanfare, without any problems, and so the flashes of light go away. You might be aware of a little bit of movement of that membrane depending on how dense it is. Fortunately, a lot of people don't have too much of symptoms with it, but you can be aware of some changes here. But you know, you start talking to 16, 17-year-olds, they're like, yeah, what else is going on? Of course, your body ages, and you know, I see a little of this and that. And my doctor told me it's nothing to worry about, so nothing to worry about. That's fine, and that's good for them. Now, there's a subset of people of this group of PVDs where they're starting off, and this is just a variation of the development of the eye, variation of normal. They just happen to have a particular thickening of that membrane right around the optic nerve head there where there are no symptoms. Like, we don't even see it. Doesn't exist as far as anybody's concerned. Until they have a PVD, and they'll pull that little membrane or that little thickened area of that membrane off the back wall there. Okay. Now, the membrane isn't being noticed so much, but you've got a density tethered and suspended, a suspender, you know, out in the middle part of the eye, and it will cast a shadow. And since this membrane sort of ebbs and flows a little bit and has a little bit of movement and a little bit of laxity in there, that shadow will move. So this moving shadow, like every other moving shadow, is a floater. This has a particular name for it. We call that a Weiss ring. That comes from the German word for white. In other words, it is a white ring, a Weiss ring. And And someone might say, well, wait a second, like I got this ring shape, but it's dark. Well, that's because you're seeing the shadow. When you're shining a light into the eye and observing the eye, the observer, the eye doctor, will see a white reflection. It's like saying, you know, is the moon light or is it dark? Well, kind of depends on what side of the moon you're talking about. If you're on the reflective side of it, it looks white. If you're on the dark side of the moon, as Pink Floyd observed, it's dark. So, you know, again, you're seeing the shadow, so it's darker. But someone, you know, probably back in the 1800s just said, you know, when we first had ophthalmoscopes in the 1860s, probably looked in there and saw this white ring and said, it is a weiße Ring. I'm going to write it down and publish it. So it's purely descriptive. Does it really matter to break these things down and subcategorize and pigeonhole them? Well, from my perspective, it does, and I'll explain why. So that's floaters. That's kind of a good overview of floaters. I think that covers most of some of the optical concepts and where they come from and so on and so forth. So now let me talk about the laser. So many people will be familiar with lasers. They'll say, I have a laser pointer that my cat loves to chase around the carpeting and halfway up the wall. It's all fun and games, right? I've seen Star Wars movies, so I know I'm an expert in lasers, sure. There's also military industrial applications. So, you know, lasers are pretty common. The most common type of laser, you might say, well, there's some sort of laser cavity. There's a source of the laser, which I don't really understand. But then there's this single beam of light that comes out and out and out, and then it strikes something, and it's a bright green or bright red light, depending on the power, you know, how far it can go. But it basically goes in one straight line until it either strikes something and reflects off that, or is just absorbed by the atmosphere if you aim it up into the sky. Okay? That's how most lasers are. Now, someone who's familiar with what I do in there, they're like, oh, well, you know, you use a YAG laser, the YAG, the yttrium aluminum garnet, puts out a certain wavelength and frequency, but they're still thinking that the laser is like this. And they might say, okay, Dr. Johnson, you know, I know you've been doing this for a lot, but what happens if you miss your target?
Ah, my eye! Well, obviously, you destroy the retina, and it goes out the back of your skull, and you die.
No, that's actually a valid question. You know, what happens if you miss? Well, the answer to that is, first of all, my laser is not like this. You know, so if the lasers that we use were like this, that would be a problem. In fact, there is an argon laser used in ophthalmology. Like, for instance, somebody comes in the door and they've got a small retinal hole or retinal tear out there. They actually will use an argon laser aimed on the retina and deliver thermal energy to basically kind of spot weld and create inflammation and create basically kind of like a tacking down spot welding of the retina out there in the periphery. So you can use that type of laser in the eye. I don't. That's an argon laser, different thing. So to answer that question of like what happens if you miss, you have to answer it in terms of like, well, let's talk about the YAG laser. So somehow the optical engineers who've designed this laser take that source of light and somehow they diverge it and then they reconverge it. And what you get emanating out of the laser cavity, or the laser itself, is this cone-shaped energy profile about something like that, about 16 degrees of cone angle. In 3 dimensions, it would be, you know, something.
Ah, you got a cone.
They've got a
Wow,
cone.
it fits.
I know, amazing,
It fits.
right?
Guys, look, check this out. Look at this. It's exact. Yeah, I've been doing this a long time.
I've been doing this a long time. My drawing has been calibrated to 16 degrees of angle there. So you've got a 16-degree angle, and that's basically universal to whatever manufacturer. A lot of them have the same source of the energy. So it is this source, this energy profile. We'll say that's like this. Now you might say, okay, well, you know, when I was a kid, I used to take like a magnifying glass, and I would go out into the sun, and then you could kind of focus. In this case, I'm going to focus the fluorescent light in a certain place, and you could say, well, there's like a cone-shaped focusing. This is a converging lens. So you might say, well, there must be a gradual increase of energy, and then on the other side, there would be a gradual decrease of energy. You would think there would be like a gradient. And I will just say, you just have to trust me, it doesn't work that way.
No
the way
way.
that
Wow.
I know, trust, I know, big deal. Effectively, the energy is 100% being delivered at one place right there. And that's really kind of the safety secret sauce. Very, very important concept to understand, because that way I can pass that laser energy through the cornea and through the lens, and not delivering any energy to those structures. And then just as importantly, on the far side there, you're not delivering even a little bit of energy to the retina. It really is pretty much 100% right there. And it has to be coherent, it has to be well focused, and the more that you come in at an oblique, or the more that you come in at an angle, the more you have problems like with small pupils, the more you have muckety-muck like multifocal lenses, things like that, the more that it sort of takes away from the energy, but it doesn't change the fact that you essentially have one focal point, and that's where the energy is delivered. Now, that doesn't take away my responsibility. My responsibility is I need to know where that's located. I need to know where that's located, and I need to keep it safely away from the important and delicate structures like the retina and like the crystalline natural lens, okay? Because we don't want to injure the retina, and we don't want to cause a cataract. This is important. There is no sort of automatic governor on the laser that prevents you from doing that. You just have to make good decisions, and you have to make good decisions consistently. And where the rubber meets the road with that is, the problem with younger patients, and like I mentioned earlier, is their floaters tend to be smaller, little clusters and nests, and small little tiny little fibers, very, very close to the retina, within a millimeter or so of the retina. And because they are suspended in a more gel-like structure, you just can't get them to move away from. There'll be a little bit of lag and a little bit of movement in the vitreous en bloc as a block or as a body. So you might get a little bit of movement in this direction. So they will see movement just like they see other floaters. But the movement isn't very much. But the important thing from my perspective is it's not swirling away. You can't get that stuff to move away from the retina. So you just can't put that into a safe place to treat. Now, this laser is focused down to about 8 to 9, I don't know if I can do this upside down, microns, thousandths of a millimeter, I'll do it that, thousandths of a millimeter, which is very, 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 very small. I could conceivably focus on the front surface of one of those floaters, but there is a little bit of a shock wave, about a millimeter or so, kind of surrounding that, and it's uncertain if that shock wave could cause some injury to the retina. I mean, it could if you're working close enough there. So that's why we have to back it out much further. Even though it's focused down to 8 or 9 thousandths of a millimeter, I need to stay a good couple millimeters or so away from the retina, especially in this area right here, overlying the most important part of the retina. But that's basically it. And what I'm doing is delivering a relatively small amount of energy over and over and over and over again, often, usually hundreds of times in a treatment session, and trying to break down that floater material. And speaking of breaking down that floater material, there is a difference in the types of floaters, in how they respond and the efficiency and all that. So when I talked about earlier about sort of like, does it really matter to pigeonhole the floaters into Weiss rings and clouds and strands? Yes, it does. A Weiss ring will always, to me, be more preferable than treating an equally sized or equally amount of protein in a cloud. It just is more efficient. It's denser, more brittle, it absorbs the laser energy better, and tends to be sort of more definitive destruction of the floaters, where the cloudier floaters, it's a little harder to grab onto. You don't get as much transfer of energy. And there's some other challenges. One of those is the cloudier floaters, even though initially you get some pretty good effect on that, they have a tendency to kind of reform and regroup a bit. So even though you're destroying some of those proteins, those won't reform and regroup. You're also scattering a bit of that protein. So that patient might have a relatively successful treatment that first session, and then they'll come back even as soon as the next day with it, typically like a little reformed, a little squiggly, little wormy kind of thing. Now, this reformation appears to have less mass, less volume, less stuff than what we started off with, but it's still bothersome and just requires more treatment. So the cloudier floaters, they talk about managing expectations. These, it feels like you're taking 3 or 4 steps forward and then backsliding a little bit, and 3 or 4 steps forward with another treatment and backsliding a little bit. So this reformation is just kind of backsliding as far as the effect. And usually the stuff that reforms tends to reform more in the middle part of the eye, still manageable, still treatable, just requires more treatment. And so the cloudier floaters, as far as managing expectations and setting expectations, they just usually require more treatment ultimately, And like from your drawing, which we haven't really sort of shown a picture of, but if you don't mind, your drawing, I asked my patients to draw a picture of there, and of course there's no standardization, but we've got a little mix of stuff here. We've got a well-defined dark spot. We have a fuzzier cloud here, maybe a strand, and I don't know what this background stuff is, maybe light moods. I don't know what to expect, I have no idea what to expect. But I guess the point is there can be a mix of different types. It's not like you either have this or this. It's quite common to have a Weiss ring and some cloudy stuff and some membranes and stuff. You know, you can have just a little bit of mix of everything in there. So some of the stuff is more efficient to treat. Some of it isn't. And you know, I don't get to cherry pick what walks through my door. I get whatever walks in the door, and I have to try to treat it as best as possible. What else? It is ultimately a low amount of energy, even with the most treatable floaters, even with like these Weiss rings, if there's nothing else going on, they almost always still benefit from a second day treatment, a little bit of cleanup. Just because, you know, little bits and pieces will scatter off there. The patient might come back and say it's 90% better, but there's a little constellation of some things. Well, the second day I'll go in there and clean that stuff up in there. Or if there's some reformation, you have to go after that. So it's, you know, I get to enjoy a lot of things in my practice. One of the things that I don't get to enjoy is that sort of one and done procedure like cataract surgery or LASIK, where you go in, you have it done. You know, this is a process, you know, which kind of leads to, okay, here's the big question is, kind of a different ways of asking the same question is like, what is success with a treatment series? How do you define success, and what's the endpoint of treatment? It's a good question. There are sort of soft endpoints, mostly. And so, like, if you ignore the picture here, and we'll say, okay, we're going to do a graph here, right? On the y-axis will be the bothersomeness, and let's just give it numbers. Let's say on a scale of 1 to 10, how much does this thing bother you? Well, people, let's say you're walking and you're saying it's a 9 out of 10. I guess it could be worse. It's bad, you know, and this is 0 treatments. Then along here will be sort of quantum events of treatment. You know, it's not a sliding scale. You're either walking in the door, or you've had 1 treatment, or you've had 2 treatments, or 3 treatments, and so on. So let's say that first treatment gets you 50% better. So somewhere in the middle there, you got that, okay? And patient comes back next day, super happy. Oh my gosh, this is great. You know, let's do some cleanup, right? And let's say that next treatment got you 30 or 40% of what remains, okay? Now, in their head, they might be doing a little light math and extrapolating and saying, well, gosh, pretty much all I need is one more treatment, right? And I say, no, it doesn't work that way. It really works more like this. Okay, so again, the 80-20 rule is I might get you 80% better, but we might be stuck in chasing after this and having little setbacks, and it's kind of better. You know, and the psychology is like the patient had such good improvement in the first couple of treatments, they just think like, well, it just takes 1 more, maybe 1 more. It just doesn't work that way. So, you know, how do you define success? Somewhere down here is a lot better, you know, than what they walked in with. Somewhere here it's a lot better, but not defined by 100%, not defined by perfection, not defined by nothing left to treat. You know, it's just, it gets harder and harder to get that last, you know, 20% or so. So, you know, that's just kind of the way it is. You know, it's worth, you know, setting that expectation for people. I try for 100%, I give 100% effort, I just can't get it usually. I've had a few patients who've said I got 100%, but for the most part, this is kind of a little bit more typical there. As far as some of the other practicalities, as far as treatment, you know, since we're delivering energy to basically dead, inert proteins, you really don't have any healing afterwards. You know, unlike injury to tissue or surgery or whatever you have, you know, you have to go through like an inflammatory. You have to, the platelets have to go and stop bleeding. You know, you get inflammation and new blood cells going in there, and laying down new collagen. You know, there's a phase of healing that you have to kind of go through. This isn't. You know, there's a few stages of recovery. One is, well, I've been shining a bright light in your eye. It takes a few minutes to kind of recover from that. It'd be the same thing if I just shined a bright flashlight in your eye. I create bubbles as I'm hitting this stuff and creating little gas bubbles. The gas bubbles, tiny little microscopic bubbles. You know, they will dissolve and just go away in 30, 45 minutes or so. There's no sort of expansion effect of the bubbles. They are truly microscopic. And then you'll be dilated, you know, 3, 4, 5 hours or so. But the results are pretty much done at the time you do the procedure. So by that evening, when the pupil comes back down, you'll have a pretty good idea of what's accomplished. And by the way, since we're not you know, lifting flaps or creating holes in the eye or anything else like that, I don't need to patch the eye. I don't need to shield the eye. We don't need to put drops in the eye. We're not treating a potential for infection. We're not treating a potential for inflammation. So there's really no restrictions on activities afterwards, other than just limited by being dilated. So if you wanted to go swim afterwards, or go exercise, or go have a margarita or something like that, I mean, yeah, go to it. There's nothing that you can do afterwards that will sabotage or undo what we've done. And as soon as that evening, or even better, the next morning, you can cover up that treated eye and say it feels 30, 60, 70% better or whatever, and come back that next day, and we can get in there and bang out another treatment and try to knock that down further, try to bring that down further as much as possible. So we can do consecutive day treatments, and I do have a lot of patients that travel, like yourself, from New York, from all over the place, some international, and fortunately we can do like consecutive day treatments. So it's not like you have to do a treatment and then wait 3 months. And by the way, the doctors that are doing this and billing insurance, there is a built-in problem with that, and that is the insurance companies require a 90-day global period. In other words, they'll do a treatment and then they'll say, come back in 90 days and we'll do another treatment. Well, that's kind of hard if you've flown several states away. And it's not because your eye needs that time to recover. The doctor won't tell you that. They'll say, we'll need to do this again in 3 months. I'm like, well, that's the problem of being handcuffed with the insurance company. There are some liberties of not working with the insurance companies and doing what you need to do in what makes sense, not necessarily I have to wait 90 days to get paid again. So some of the story that they don't tell you. I think that covers pretty much what I want to cover. Do you have any unanswered questions from that?
No, none at all. No, very thorough.
Wow, guys, now that was so much information. I don't know, man. When I first planned this trip, didn't know what to expect. But now I'm so glad I came to Arlington, Texas. Anyway, so this is just a small part of the Floater Doctor experience. And I got like the visit video, the treatment video, which of course I'm still editing and compiling and everything. So that's coming soon. But this one was a easy one to do, presentation, and that's it. So stick around for more Floater Doctor videos coming up. At least like 3 more. I don't think I can fit it all into one long video, okay? So thank you for watching. If you enjoyed it, please press like. Also visit the Floater Doctor's channel. I'll have the link in the description below and everything like that. All right, thanks for watching. Have a good night, guys.